Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin shortly, and I ask that you switch your mobile devices to silent or vibrate mode for the duration of our program, please. This will ensure that we do not distract the speakers and also to minimize any interference with our recording of the show this evening. Our entire debate is expected to run for no more than 90 minutes, and there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions to the panel. And for this, because we're recording the entire show to be aired later on ABC Radio, it is our request that when asking your questions, please speak clearly into the microphone, be specific with your questions, and identify the person you are addressing your question to, please. You can also submit your questions during tonight's forum through the World Bank live page and tweet using the hashtag #FuturePacifica. We hope to have a healthy debate this evening, and we know that we will not all agree with the points that will be discussed. However, we hope that we can, however, agree that we have one aim, and that is to protect our oceans, and let us keep that in mind. Thank you sincerely for your cooperation. The Vice Chancellor and President of the University of the South Pacific, Professor Paul Aluwalia, Mrs. Aluwalia, who's joined us this evening, the World Bank Resident Representative for the South Pacific, Mr. Lasse Melgaard, members of the Diplomatic Corps, Your Excellencies, senior officials of government, heads of regional institutions, industry leaders, executives, partners, stakeholders, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, Nisambula Vinaka, and warm greetings. Our formalities begin with the welcome remarks, and to deliver this, ladies and gentlemen, I invite the Vice Chancellor and President of the University of the South Pacific, Professor Paul Aluwalia.
Mr. Lasse Melgaard, Resident Representative for the South Pacific, the World Bank, members of the Diplomatic Corps, regional and international organizations, distinguished members of the panel, representatives of the World Bank, staff, alumni, and students of USP at Laucala, and those tuning in from around the region, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. A very good evening to you all. Nisambula, it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to the university and to this extremely significant interactive discussion on a topic which is of utmost relevance to our region. We're honored to be hosting the first USP World Bank Future Pacifica Dialogue at the university. You'll be pleased to learn that there are more in the pipeline and that we'll be hosting more of these debates. The topic for today's panel discussion is healthy oceans, and we're all eager to hear the insights of our panelists on a contemporary significant challenge of climate change that plagues our region. At a global level, we live on an ocean planet accounting for 71% of the surface area that has been absorbed, that has absorbed the majority of climate change heat in the margins of 90% of total extra heat in the last 50 years. This poses a major threat to oceans as the biggest resource for our region, and the time for action for mitigation is now. The ocean's fish life is suffering from overfishing, as 30% of species are critically overfished, and I'm sure our panelists will talk about this. And the issue of sustainability is vital, as a majority of communities in the Pacific region rely heavily on fish and other ocean resources for subsistence and commercial purposes. But it's not just fish, it's also pollution, particularly plastics, herbicides, pesticides, heavy metals, petroleum products, fertilizers that are causing long-term changes in all ocean systems. And we need to raise awareness of the responsible use and disposal of these as the seas and oceans are not the rightful place for such items. It seriously distorts the ecosystems that surround us and impedes the reproductive capacity of sea lives. Sea level rise has been increasing and potentially could double previous estimates, 65 centimeters by 2100, and caused by ocean warming and ice melting on land. And the impact of these can be seen in Micronesian countries, particularly places like Tuvalu and Kiribati, and the pollutions of which are exposed to major climate threats. Many other Pacific Island countries will also be significantly affected in the next 50 years. For us as a university, we see ocean action as a critical component of climate action, and ocean-related mitigation and adaptation measures we believe can help countries accelerate and increase their climate mitigation strategies. Thus, there's widespread interest in strengthening the links between climate change and ocean change in the scientific and political fields, and more research efforts are needed to better understand future ocean responses to climate change, as well as how the ocean can contribute to climate solutions for the future. On behalf of the university, I want to acknowledge the partnership with the World Bank. The bank is collaborating with the university in strengthening the capacity of its ICT regulatory institutions in the participating countries and enhancing regional collaboration and knowledge sharing on ICT regulatory issues through the previously established Pacific Islands Regulatory Resource Center. We're also proud to partner with the World Bank Group in organizing such joint policy dialogues, especially on topics of mutual interest, including climate and natural disaster resilience, fisheries, tourism, healthy oceans, and a series of other topics. This initiative involves a collaboration between technical experts within the bank, the university, and expertise available within the region, including women and youth, with a view to raising awareness and enhancing abilities of our Pacific people to confront the impact of oceans and climate change. So I very much look forward to the deliberations today and thank the panelists in advance for what I am sure will be an inspiring discussion. But equally, I welcome everybody in the audience. These discussions won't be anything if it wasn't for your presence today, and your interaction and involvement, as Michelle has said, later in the program will be highly valued and most welcome. So once again, welcome to the university, and we really hope that this will be the start of a great partnership as we bring more and more of these debates in the future. Thank you very much.
Binnaka Bakalevu Professor Aluwalia, ladies and gentlemen, please another round of applause. It is now my humble duty to invite from the World Bank, please welcome Mr. Lasse Melgaard.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Thank you very much, Vice Chancellor, for your warm welcome and remarks. As mentioned, my name is Lasse Melgaard. I'm the resident representative for the South Pacific. We just opened our office here in March, and an office that now covers, in addition to Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, Kiribati, Tuvalu, and Nauru. It's my pleasure as well to be here along with the Vice Chancellor to welcome you to this inaugural Future Pasifika discussion. It's the first step in what we really see as an exciting new partnership between USP, the World Bank, and our sister private sector organization, the International Finance Corporation. The name Future Pasifika, incidentally, was chosen through a crowdsourcing exercise where we asked the now 170,000 people that regularly follow the Facebook page of the World Bank Pacific what they thought would be an appropriate name, and they came up with Future Pasifika. So it's chosen in a highly democratic manner, and we're delighted with it. The partnership is also a reflection of the World Bank Group's commitment to working with partners and institutions like USP across the Pacific, not just on project, on technical issues, but also on initiatives that really foster a dialogue and draws on the expertise in the region. And as we further expand the presence of the World Bank Group and our engagement across the Pacific, we're keen to listen to the voices of the Pacific and ensure that there's a strong local anchor in everything that we do. The World Bank strongly echoes the sentiment of many ocean advocates, including, I'm sure, some of the sentiments that we'll hear this evening, and really want to encourage everyone to do their part and step up and play really a critical role in the protection of our precious, life-giving oceans, especially in the Blue Pacific. At the World Bank, we're doing this at the regional level through the development of a regional maritime plastics debris engagement framework, and also through the Pacific Regional Oceanscape Program, which supports better management of coastal and oceanic fisheries. And some of you may have heard of the Global Fund on the Blue Economy, which is called Pro-Blue, which the World Bank has also set up, which will help finance solutions for marine litter across the globe. But of course, we are just one of many partners and organizations supporting the Pacific Islands on the oceans front, and I'd like to acknowledge their work, including those represented here in Suva and via the live stream today. I very much look forward to the discussion, look forward to hearing some of the concrete ideas that may come out, and I also look forward to future editions of Future Pacifica as our panelist debates the issues of the region and how we best meet them head on. Vinakavaklevo.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I ask we give Mr. Melgard another round of applause? Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, with our formalities now complete, we'll begin with the forum proper, and I invite our panel to please come forward and take their seats up in front. Thank you. All right, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Hello and welcome to this new panel discussion series, Future Pacifica, co-hosted by the University of the South Pacific, the World Bank, and its sister organization, the International Finance Corporation. I'm Michelle Tevita Singh from USB. This event is being live streamed globally via World Bank Live. Feel free to submit questions during tonight's forum and tweet using the hashtag #FuturePacifica. Tonight, we're broadcasting from USB's Laucala Campus in Suva, Fiji, and live streaming to USB's campuses across the Pacific. We know healthy oceans are vital to the prosperity of Pacific communities and the global ecosystem. Covering more than 30% of the Earth's surface, the Pacific Ocean is the largest water mass on the planet. With a surface area of about 160 million square kilometers, the ocean basin is larger than the landmass of all the continents combined. Is the Pacific Ocean in crisis, with issues of overfishing, marine pollution, and coastal erosion exacerbated by the impact of climate change? Just how healthy is our ocean? Those are the questions up for debate tonight in this first Future Pacifica Forum. To discuss this topic, we're joined by Dr. Stuart Kennenmonth, the head of school and senior lecturer at the School of Marine Studies here at USB. He's had over 20 years of field experience in marine and coral reef ecology, including leading teams across the Great Barrier Reef and the Coral Sea. We have Maureen Pinchueli, the coordinator of the Pacific Network on Globalization, PANG, a leading regional non-government organization. Born on the island of Rotuma, Maureen is a dedicated activist pursuing environmental, social, and economic justice issues for over 20 years. Zakia Ali, a member of Project Survival Pacific, which was formed by a network of young people passionate about climate action, resilience, sustainability, and healthy oceans in the Pacific. And finally, Mr. Justin Hunter, the founder of J. Hunter Pearls. Born to an American father and Fijian mother, he grew up in the town of Savu in Fiji, where he says his love of the island life and the ocean began. Let's make them feel welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We all know the broad threats the the oceans face from climate change. So let's get straight to some of the specifics. Dr. Stewart, you've had over 2 decades of field experience in marine and coral reefs. We are in Fiji, which has two of the world's longest reefs. There has been incidents of coral bleaching. What impact do these events have on the health of the oceans? So, well, in short, are our oceans healthy?
Thanks, Michelle. Certainly, the oceans are in trouble. There's no debate about that. And for many years now, they've been looking after us. They've absorbed a lot of the excess from climate change, both carbon dioxide and heat. They've absorbed large amounts of pollutants. And yet, we've taken as many fish as we possibly can, as though there's no tomorrow. We have essentially raised the acidity of the oceans, and we've added lots of plastics and pollutants and all sorts of rubbish into the system. And we continue to treat the oceans in a way which is lacking in respect. And the oceans are now starting to show signs of really being in quite a large amount of trouble. Yes.
Dr. Stewart, you mentioned acidification. So we know that both ocean warming and acidification make it more difficult for coral to regrow. Yes? What sort of danger do rising levels of acidity pose to ocean health?
Acidity is a very nasty part of the equation. In fact, you might not realise, but our own body, if we lower the acidity by just 0.2, we'll start to have seizures and possibly even die. So for the ocean, just to have small shifts in acidity doesn't just remove calcium carbonate from the shells of all the mollusks and corals, it starts to affect all the metabolic processes for all the animals living in those environments. And so we don't quite fully yet know how that will translate, but we do know acidity changes are very bad for virtually all the marine life.
Dr. Stewart, you've described climate change previously as a storm on the horizon. Mm-hmm. And we know Pacific Island nations stand on the front lines of climate change. Now, in terms of oceans, why is it a storm on the horizon? What are you concerned about here?
Well, as I was talking to Justin just earlier, the climate change is only just starting to show its effect here in the Pacific. We're seeing small changes, but not really dramatic changes. Whereas the storm on the horizon is that it's approaching. It's going to get much worse. And during that period, we have to start to look at the domestic issues around the world. Things like overfishing, things like runoff from the catchments, the whole ridge to reef type approach. We have to try to get our reefs to be resilient and strong and healthy so that when the storm does arrive, they get a chance to basically to get through it in a way which is going to be suitable for us as well, for all the humans living on all the islands around the Pacific.
All right, Dr. Stewart, we're going to touch, plastics a little later on, but you said get our coral reefs prepared. I mean,
yes.
Ready. Can you just elaborate a bit more?
Yeah, sure. Coral reefs by themselves are full of different types of organisms. We have a range of benthic critters from the sea cucumbers right through to the little crabs and all sorts of little organisms that you'll hardly see. We also have all the fish on top of that who are living in the crevices and eating each other and eating the algae and eating some of the coral and basically building up towards the large sharks. And all of those fit together. So if you remove some parts of that, you end up making the reef much less resilient, much more open to things like coral disease, to not recovering from bleaching, having lots of algae override the system. And that's what we're seeing now. So the reefs in the Caribbean, which have had these stresses for a long time, they collapse with just a small amount of pressure, whereas the reefs here in Fiji still luckily have a significant amount of resilience in their system so that they can bounce back. So when you get a big cyclone coming through, that bounces back really fast.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart, which brings me to our next panelist here. I mean, we're talking about awareness and ensuring that, this can continue. Very important point being made here. But we have Zakia, a young person, someone who's still studying here at the university, and a member of Project Survival Pacific. So, Zakia, what's your biggest fear for our oceans? Is it a crisis issue?
Thank you, Michelle. I think it is a well-established and also a very subtle fact that the land and the ocean are interconnected. And this is, particularly true for the Pacific, where people here have a very strong relationship, a very close relationship with the oceans. 40 years ago, the concept of plastic pollution, ocean plastic pollution, was almost unheard of. Today, it is one of the most pressing issues that requires our immediate attention. So yes, I do believe that it is a crisis that faces us, and I think there's a lady, she works quite closely with the indigenous people in Quebec. Her name is Alanis Obamsawin, and I think she quite perfectly surmises the very possibility of our near future. And she says, and I quote, "When the last tree has been cut, when the last fish has been caught, when the last river has been poisoned, only then will we realize, albeit too late, that one cannot eat money." And that is the reality that faces us today.
Well, I think we're very lucky to have young activists like you to be very vocal about these things. So, great job so far, Zakia, and it's forums like this that we hope that you can continue to, to create awareness around this. You've also been quite vocal in saying that Pacific women have been battling the climate crisis for years. What are the concerns about the way women are impacted by changes in the health of oceans?
Thank you, Michelle. In the Pacific, as a result of gender norms, traditionally, women, particularly indigenous women, particularly women in coastal communities, it becomes their primary role to gather food, to hunt for food, to go out to the oceans and do fishing. So because of these issues of overexploitation, women are most impacted. I'd also like to add on that recently the UNSG was here, and he echoed, the similar sentiments when he said that when we talk about the climate crisis, when we talk about issues such as what's happening with our ocean, the fact is that catastrophes of this nature, what they do is that they exacerbate existing social inequality. So that's another reason how women, are impacted in particular. In Fiji, when we look at small to medium enterprises, close to 80%, are made up by women. And you see women who use resources from the sea, and they later sell this in municipal markets all around Fiji. By the roadsides they have stalls and whatnot. So this is how they're also affected economically.
Thank you, Zaki. We're talking about women, we're talking about the impact on the community. Brings me to Maureen Pincherelli. Given Pacific Islands live in a world surrounded by an ocean, how important is the ocean to the essence of the Pacific Island way of life?
I think I've described the ocean as our bloodline, our lifeline. And I think it's really, a lot of us have forgotten this real truth about the oceans. And for me, it was almost having to come back to this idea of being an ocean person again. And it struck me in various different ways, but really trying to understand how this space called oceans or the Pacific has been imagined and reimagined, and how the imagined, particularly by outsiders, becomes a reality. From the doctrines of discovery, of exotica, savages, noble savages, natives, to the doctrines of small island dependent states, to a space of underexploited, undertapped imagined, reimagined, and is now a lived reality that we see and experience. And I think when I was looking and searching for answers, when you are a dependent state, when you are dependent on aid, and you're perceived to be really poor, those are very strong narratives that can disempower Pacific peoples. So I started to search. My background's in marine science, environmental science. I work in the field of economics and trade. But I almost had to go back to history and politics to find Pacific-centric voices and narratives, to reimagine this space from a Pacific lens, and to reconnect with this thing called oceans. What does it mean for a Pacific Islander today? Is it a space that is separate, that we look at, that we swim in, or is it essentially who we are? And so I discovered Epeli Haofa's writings, Teresia Tewa's writings, that really grounded me to really say that the ocean is us. We are the ocean. And the metaphor of the ocean frees Pacific people from this very narrow understanding of place, space, and time. And I think it's really essential in a time of crisis, in a time where, when you consider the kinds of descriptions of our problems, we need to go back to some of these understandings of who we are as ocean people. What is our responsibility as a people who've been, Teresia describes it really well, that we've been gifted as custodians of this space. Our ancestors traveled it. They traveled it well, they occupied it, and they kept it and made it our responsibility to gift it again, re-gift it again. But I've always been fascinated by these types of dominant narratives and Pacific ways of thinking as a response in times of crisis. So that's, yeah.
Thanks, Maureen. You also called on Pacific people to, quote, take back their home and protect their ocean as its guardian. Do you see evidence of that happening?
Absolutely. I think that there's, and I'm glad to see Dr. Transform in the audience today, and I would like to acknowledge him, because I think that's part of the taking back of our stories and our narratives. We have to control our stories and narratives. Otherwise, someone else will write it for us, and we will be written into history. And I think the story of fish is a critical story, that you can change dominant narratives, that it is possible, despite your smallness, our dependency and vulnerabilities, it is possible to turn these types of stories and narratives. And I think the Pacific has a real history of demonstrating, and people like to say we punch above our weight, which is true. If you look at some of the biggest challenges of times, whether it was the nuclear testing, over 300 thermonuclear tests was taken in this space called ocean, because it was considered vast and would be able to absorb all of its powers, because we were dismissed as too small in terms of population, and we were used to be held up as for the global common good, for global peace. This region has demonstrated that we can bring an end to nuclear testing. We have it in us, an agency to turn these types of narratives. You can take this from the point of drift net fishing, deep sea mounts. A lot of these global issues, Pacific peoples continue to lead. Climate, the moral authority and leadership on climate and climate change comes from this region, because we understand it in ways that a lot of people don't understand it. The global north is just glimpsing that storm. We understand it. And so I think it's for Pacific peoples to realize that we do come from very strong histories and possibilities of changing narratives and making it really work. And the fish story of the parties of the Nauru Agreement is currently you see Pacific peoples setting the rules, designing the rules, and making it work for their own people, for our people. So it is possible. But we have to look for these stories. We have to consistently find them because they exist everywhere in terms of people's resilience, but they exist. And so, yes.
Thank you. You've shared a bit, about what's happening globally and bringing it down to the Pacific. I wondered if you could also share, seeing the ocean as the lifeline of the Pacific people, to what extent is that lifeline under strain? And how is it impacting people today? I mean, you've talked a little bit about the Pacific, so from the community perspective.
So if I could just use an example of deep sea mining. Deep sea mining is a new frontier issue. The communities in Papua New Guinea are probably some of the very first communities that are already experiencing the impacts of exploration. Not at full exploitation, just exploration. It is taking place about 30 kilometers from shore in the Bismarck Sea, one of the most biodiverse areas. You've got tuna stocks flowing through, you've got whales, dolphins coming through. The communities in the Bismarck Sea that really resist and call for a ban on seabed mining, they really believe that this body of water is their lifeline. And not in this simplistic ways about just access to food and livelihood. They really believe that that is their pathways between this world and the next world. And that mining interrupts the natural and the supernatural world. And those pathways that will just sever the ties between their ancestors and people today. They're shark calling activities. So it's more than just livelihoods. And seabed mining is one of those critical issues that we're seeing right across the Pacific, where it is already creating tensions between existing lifelines around food security, economic activities, which is your industrial fishing, tourism for that matter. But for communities, they're very clear about what this ocean means to them. And it is more than just food. And if you're looking at it from a purely protein source of protein, it's 70% of protein for people in the Pacific comes from the ocean. So I think when we say it's a lifeline, it really is people's lifeline, both their spiritual lifeline, their physical well-being, and then there's also obviously the environmental functions that goes with that.
Thanks, Maureen. I'm glad that you raised the seabed mining or deep ocean mining, because it seems that those who are pushing for this generally claim that only a fraction of the seabed now covered by exploration permits would actually be mined. Is that any consolation?
No, I think the problematic nature of deep sea mining is that it's not well understood. Like there's very little that you can reference point. I think Japan is the only country that has undertaken full-scale mining within its EEZ. You have no reference point. This is an untried industry. It's operating in a place, again, narratives are important. It's considered untapped and underexploited. So people go for what they consider to be the value of the minerals and the seafloor. Very little is understood. You're looking at depths of between 300 to 6,000 meters of depths, taking place in some of the most biodiverse areas, hydrothermal vents, which are considered to be the beginnings of life. We just don't know enough. And the science is each day, each year, the science starts to come up with new data about these areas, the complexities of these areas and climate change. So we are only learning, and yet industry is already propositioning that this is going to be small scale, and so high value, little impact. They already made those kinds of broad pronouncements which are problematic, highly problematic. And so for countries like our countries who are quite desperate for revenue, of course, if you say it's $1 billion industry, of course, if you say it's going to be small scale, little impact, you know, it's out there, nobody lives there, no communities live there, it's going to be okay. But I think increasingly the science is catching up on just how bad. I think descriptions right now is that it could be quite, I don't want to get the word wrong, so I'm just going to say it's like horrific in its scale, particularly if you're hitting some of those key areas. So I think, endemic, you lose all of your endemic species, you don't even know what you've got, and then you've gone ahead and destroyed it. So I think the nature in which the industry was first described, small scale, little impact, high returns, is quite attractive.
Thank you, Maureen. I know, Dr. Stewart, you might want to have your say on that, but I'll have to come back to you. We'll move over to Mr. Justin Hunter. As the founder of the Pearl Company, J. Hunter Pearls, how important is it from your perspective that the private sector be not only part of the debate, but also part of the solutions to fixing ocean-related problems? Just take a second, please.
I think the private sector has been described as kind of the 800-pound gorilla in the room. That, when you get private sector finally engaged in terms of creating economic returns and conservation together, then we're going to actually see commitment and see some, some real change. The ocean acidification, for example, I think a lot of that was brought about when hatcheries on the west coast of the U.S. all of a sudden couldn't get larvae through, and they were kind of on the front lines of that. But the greatest threat to our oceans, and what we can do today in Fiji, being island nations, is going to be trying to eradicate the poverty we have. The greatest threat we have is poverty. We do not have these sewage systems in place. We allow overfishing. We can put in all the MPAs you want in the world, but if you can't feed your family, you can't expect people to honor that. So the only way we're going to do that is by creating economic returns that is based on conservation.
Mr. Hunter, congratulations. I know that you signed up, you're signing up for the United Nations Blue Pledge for Sustainable Pearls. Yes? You'll be taking the Blue Pledge at the UN during Climate Week in New York later this year. What's the aim of your Blue Pledge?
Well, of course, being private sector, we're trying to engage and create awareness about our product. And that is why we're good at this. We want to create monetary returns. The Blue Pledge is about highlighting the corporate, social, and marine environmentally responsible producers, talking about all of the ecosystem services that pearl oysters and bivalve aquaculture do, and most importantly, the amount of economic activity that is created around these pearl farms and pearling activities, because you get whole communities engaged. You have to then go beyond our own farm borders to make sure that rubbish dumps are being done in a proper way, that sewage treatment plants are being done. And we need to find more of that, and for us, the Blue Pledge will be circular in terms of most of the pearls come from some of the highest biodiversity parts of the world. We want to empower other pearl farmers to make sure that they are following corporate, social, and responsible policies, because when you're producing luxury also there's a great responsibility. It's about rarity and making sure we do it right. And some of this comes to ensuring that these other pearl companies are locally owned, and a large proportion of the income for these pearls comes back to country of origin.
All right, so in effect, then you're saying that marine pearl farming can be a renewable industry, right? So
It's actually good for the environment.
really good. All right, we'll take your word for it. What's the business case for working sustainably? Does it still deliver profits?
You know, everything we do is to attract our consumer, and we are responding to the consumer. And today it's the conscientious consumer who is going to make the difference. If we can, our economy here is so small, our economies of scale are so tiny compared to Southeast Asia. Transform Aquarius is here, who's working on value-adding fish in the islands. You know, it's going to cost more, but if you tell the consumer, yes, this can of tuna is going to cost a little bit more, but it's from Fiji or Samoa or Tonga, and because of that, they've reduced the amount of fishing ships in the region, and we're value adding and creating economic returns. The consumer will make that choice for us. And that is where we're going to start getting tangible change, because then all our products also start creating this level of awareness. We can touch everybody who buys a pearl. I always like to say should feel like it's not just a beautiful pearl. They should feel like they're investing in our oceans and the health of the planet, because they are. And I think we've got to be aggressive about that.
Interesting. I mean, you're talking about the health of the oceans. Now, we've heard that acidity is the biggest threat to the health of the ocean. Would you agree?
I would agree globally, just like CO2 emissions is the main focus of COP. And that's great on a global scale, but I think we've got a lot more pressing things, because we're sitting on top of the biodiversity that the rest of the world needs. And you can only have so many stressors on a marine ecosystem. And we've got no excuse for the amount of fertilizer and runoff that we're allowing to happen, which is just putting another layer of stress. The ocean is very adaptable, but we've got to make sure that there's not cumulative stresses on it. And that means getting strategic partners out there. There's a lot of funding that should be coming in and working with the root cause of some of these issues, which is not planting coral, which is a great thing, but let's fix sewage plants. Let's reduce the amount of fertilizers and runoff, and let's start being more proactive and less reactive.
Thank you. You raised waste management, and that's something we'll get into discussing. But if I can go back to Dr. Stewart, I know you'd probably have a few things you'd like to add there before we get into overfishing. Yes? All right. So do you want to just add to what has been shared by Justin, and also a little earlier from Maureen on the is it deep sea mining? Yes.
Well, certainly Justin's completely right. We need to get our house in order, and one of the biggest problems facing the Pacific Island is overfishing. There's no sugarcoating it. We are literally taking more than we can sustain, and the message by many countries now is that we should be focusing on actually eating pelagic small fish and not big fish. We get a lot more food value out of a small fish if you eat the whole fish, for instance, whereas a large fish has a large ecosystem value. In other words, it does all these great things for you, whereas a pelagic small fish can be managed much better. So overfishing is a really big problem. Combine that with the flow off the land of nutrients and fertilizers and everything that's disrupting the reefs, and you've got a double hit. But deep sea mining is the last thing we need. Deep sea mining is a major problem. It's extracting minerals that we have on land, and it's going into an area of the world that we know so little about. And it's true to say that time slows down when you go down deep into the ocean, that all the animals are very long-lived. The recovery takes hundreds of years to recover, whereas up at the surface, it's used to those changes. So deep sea mining is really got to be put into to the back burner. We do not need it at the moment. It's not economically viable, and it has the potential to really upset Pacific fishing and livelihoods across. So it's not acceptable.
All right. Well, because you've added a little bit on overfishing, still on overfishing, Dr. Stewart, we live in an age where technology is constantly evolving. Do you think is technology beating the fish then?
Oh, completely. Technology is the number one driver. So in areas of the Pacific where technology has not had a big impact, the fishing is under control. That's that simple. So where you've got technology coming in with GPSs, new lines, fast boats, et cetera, fishing is a problem because it's just so easy to get it. And one of the big issues facing the Pacific countries at the moment is the torch. An underwater torch will allow you to do nighttime spearfishing, and that means you can target any fish you like. The parrotfish that don't eat your bait, a whole range of fish that just are asleep when you go down with your torch. And we're seeing large damage caused by the torch technology.
Thank you. Maureen, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization, now overfishing is increasing over time, and about 1/3 of the world's fish stocks are now overfished. At the grassroots level, do you see that having an impact now across the Pacific?
Absolutely. But I think we need to be, one of the things that we don't do well is really talk about who is doing the overfishing. And I think that's quite critical. I think it's really, it comes down to Justin's point about poverty and inequality and what people will do. But is that the real pressure around overfishing? And I think we need to place a significant amount of the problem statement on industrial fishing nations whose technology is, I mean, if you know what a super seiner can do in a couple of hours, I mean, it is quite phenomenal. That's a problem statement, and that is identifying who is causing the problem in the first place, as opposed to, and you can acknowledge that, yes, communities and some of these fisher people who do go at night with the torches, but we need to appropriate this blame game and name it for what it is. We have a problem with industrial fishing nations. The kinds of technology, the super seiners that are coming in, the Spanish super seiners that are coming in, the amount they catch is a problem. And we cannot continue business as usual on that kind of industrial scale. So I think we need to look at these quite carefully. The fisherman who is going out at night, what other opportunities exist for that fisherman at night? Is the way education can help them to understand the more complex issues around the depletion of fish and fish stocks. But if you speak to communities, they will tell you they're having to go out further, beyond the reef. They're having to do crazy things like that because the stocks are depleting. And it's depleting from numerous points, not just from the person who's doing that. So I think we need to be clearer in terms of our articulation of who, where is that pressure coming from, who is doing the most damage, and then deal with that, of which one is through trying to educate our people that they do have some sense of they have to. It is their interest to protect some of these resources. But I think we need to be careful about just, because it's a very complex area. And when you hear the community stories, it's always when the industrial fishing boats came in, the pressure increased, they had to go out, they're now doing all kinds of things. So I think we just need to think very carefully, but the stories remain the same. Not enough catch sizes are smaller, having to go out further and further just to put food on the table. So we do have some real issues of what are we going to do around questions of livelihoods, who do we hold responsible for?
What are we going to do? Who do we hold responsible? These are key questions that, that need to be asked. And yet we're seeing that this is something that is growing. What would you like to see other than awareness? I mean, what would you like to see done to stop such practices?
I mean, I think the deep sea mining one is quite, in some ways, very simplistic. I mean, really call on the region to consider a moratorium until they understand enough about the industry itself, because that's another added pressure to be considered in the complexities of oceans and ocean health right now that we don't need, and it's true. It can go on a back burner. The minerals are not going to go anywhere. But if you want to build rare pearls and gems of a healthy ocean, you have to consider and situate seabed mining in that. There's some straightforward things that countries can consider. I think we need to improve the way we take decisions around policy, that it's not in isolation and not in its little pockets of separation, because I think that's the most problematic way to kind of do that. And I think we have to locate people's voices in these spaces much more effectively than we've done before. We need to really bring in landowners, community people into these kinds of discussions around resources and do that better, because I don't think we're doing it well at all. And I think that may shift some of the answers, but I don't think there is a neat answer to all of these things. Education, I think, is still necessary. You only have to go to the supermarket to see so much that's wrong with fishing and our catches. So I still think education, but perhaps really think through why the way we're educating, why is it not penetrating? Why is it not changing behaviors, maybe alternatives? But I think a combination of this would be necessary.
Thank you, Maureen. And yes, education brings me back to you, Zakia. Fish and shellfish are critically important in terms of providing protein for people, especially in the Pacific region. Fish, we know, plays a critically important role in global food security and nutrition. How concerned are you about the impacts of declining fish stocks on people's diet, especially for future generations in the Pacific?
Now, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization has estimated that 70% of the planet's fish stock have either been fully used, overused, or in critical conditions, which means it's almost going to be overused or fully used. And going back to what Maureen said, 70% of protein for Pacific people is derived from the oceans. So it's truly quite shocking and even unimaginable to think that there might be a future, that in a few years' time, fish will no longer be a staple part of our diet. I think it's very concerning, and all the more reason why government inaction has to turn into action. All the more reason why we need to stop foreign fishing vessels from exploiting our waters, our Pacific waters.
I mean, Maureen spoke a lot, what she stressed on education and creating that awareness. I mean, I'm sure you agree with me that this is something, and then having to push that in your activism. I mean, how can we, I think, as academics or experts in the field, create more awareness around this that is more sort of focused for the youth?
I'm quite conflicted when I think about it. I really don't think it's people in the Pacific that are contributing to depleting fish stock, and I think this is something that you know along the lines of what you said. I really think it's foreign fishing vessels. When we think about indigenous knowledge that is with the people, and how, at least in Fiji, how Itokes have always relied on the oceans for subsistence, and later as a source of employment. They don't even have the resources to fish more than they don't even have the capacity to overfish. They don't have refrigerators to be able to keep fish for long periods of time. So I'm not sure we can blame or we can, I think the blame really lies on foreign fishing vessels, and I think there's a lot more regulation needed there. while it is true that locals continue to perhaps, catch undersized fish, etc., I think it is a good sign as far as the government is concerned, as far as, the relevant ministry is concerned, in that they are, more strictly monitoring these activities.
Thank you. Thank you, Zakia. Justin, in your UN pledge, you raised the idea of working with environmental NGOs to determine how pearl farms could be established as quasi-marine protected areas. How would that work, or how would they work?
The well, a pearl farm is known as an indicator species or pearl oysters, which means that any decline in water quality quite often leads to a decline in pearl quality oyster health. And yet at the same time, one of our pearl oysters filters about 1,400 liters of water a day. And that is physically cleaning and chemically cleaning a lot of our waste. You're removing CO2 is going into the shell as a blue carbon sink. You're removing nitrogen via algae and all of these things. I think the future is going to be a lot of large MPAs, and then you're going to have areas where you're going to have sustainable aquaculture. I think, from my standpoint, I think that is something that can be done because it is reliant on a healthy environment. So you've got a sense of marine stewardship amongst these communities that are involved with aquaculture. You're also cleaning that water. You're cleaning the waste, but it all has to be part of an integrated resource management plan. There's you can do it, and I think it's about allowing those opportunities to come, because the way things have been done for the last 40 years and where that funding has gone hasn't produced a lot of results, to be quite honest. And I think we have to look forward and have resource management plans in place and get people more engaged.
Thank you, Justin. I mean, you're talking about people engagement in the community and taking ownership and stewardship. But Dr. Stewart, are marine protected areas a good way of helping communities feel ownership and they're part of the solution?
Yes, it's. I think in the original plan, the marine protected areas might get imposed on a community, and I think that hasn't worked. There's been a bit of a failure because the communities didn't have that ownership. Nowadays, we tend to work with the communities to develop the knowledge about the system. In fact, your point exactly, that the communities begin to realise what they have in front of them, and then from that work towards solutions. And one of the best solutions has got to be having some area put aside for the natural processes without disturbance. And it's proven over and over again around the world that a well-managed, large enough marine protected area works. And the science is very clear. And the communities are now, the ones who have adopted these practices and have worked towards it, are actually very happy because they don't have to now drive around searching for the fish population. They know they just have to go to the edge of their marine reserve and they can catch themselves a fish, come back, give it to the family, the fish is nice size. Everybody's happy. It's a win-win for everyone. So the marine protected areas, done properly, do work, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart. So do you think that regulations such as banning certain catches of fish, as some countries have implemented, is that effective?
The marine protected areas are great at one level, but there are a number of other tools that have to be put in place, and things like seasonal ban on fish when they're breeding and engaging. They're very susceptible to overfishing. We have to look at that. We have to look at the netting size and some of the technology applications to catching fish. How can that be regulated such that the fishing itself doesn't get too overextended? And the pelagic fishing with the super trawlers is a very good case in point. for the coral reefs themselves, we have to really take an area-based approach, and we have to think of it from a range of perspectives. For instance, we now very clearly know that dynamite fishing is just not on. It destroys the habitat. You might catch some fish today, but tomorrow less so. And so things like those destructive practices have to be treated as basically not in the interests of the communities there and outlawed. Yep.
Maureen, would you agree? Are these regulations enforced? Are they effective?
I mean, I think the key word is enforced. You can have lots of regulations, look great on paper, but unless you can enforce it, it has no value or meaning. And sometimes that requires political will, financial resources, you know. And then we need to be also a bit careful with regulations also. The purpose of and the reasons for regulating. Sometimes we regulate to enable exploitation such as deep sea mining. So I think we have to be very particular about what kinds of regulations we are talking about. So in the case of deep sea mining, we are regulating to enable exploitation. But yes, enforcement is key. And I think we've got wonderful acts and regulations in the Pacific, but not enough political will and resources. If you look at our environment departments, if you look at a number of scientists, just human basic resources for enforcement and policing it, there is a significant gap to make sure that enforcement actually works. The kinds of, if you just go into any country in the Pacific, the kinds of capacities necessary for enforcement, it's still lacking. So, yeah, enforcement, but backed with political will and resources. Otherwise, it's meaningless.
All right, thank you, Maureen. I think we can't discuss healthy oceans without, of course, discussing or mentioning plastics. And I know that, a lot of you have already spoken a little about this. Now, the flow of plastics into rivers and oceans is getting worse as production and demand for plastics increases globally. It's estimated 8 million tons of plastic waste enters the oceans every year, the equivalent of a dump truck of plastic per minute. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, Maureen, before I move over to Zakia.
I think I have a different take on it. I mean, my view is that we're a little bit obsessed with plastics. And I think it distracts from some of the more complex problems. And my thing with plastics is that we are on the receiving end of it. We're the product users of it. So even if you just change it to something else, it doesn't deal with the production side of things. I think we need to go for production of plastics, which is not our problem either. I think that's what strikes me, is that we're making plastics our problem. And I think that this should be about the production. Who is producing it? If it's China, then we need to look at how it's being produced, and then scaling it down, because otherwise we are just doing individual things. And the reason why I say that also is because globally we can see so much policy influence going into plastics cleanup campaigns, and it's an end use. It's about a behavioral thing. Go after production. It's not our problem, and yet it's in our ocean. And it reminds me that perhaps we should look at no man is an ocean now, because everything that's created elsewhere is now the Pacific's problem. Climate change is now our problem. Plastics is now our problem. We have a great plastic patch in the Pacific Ocean that we have to figure out. And so much resources is going into technology to clean it up. We have to go after production. We have to go after the hard stuff and try to minimize from that end, so that we're not dealing with behavioral change, long-term educational behavioral changes on this side. So I do take a little bit of a concern about the way plastics is driving policy resources, financing, when I think it really should be about production.
Thank you, Maureen. I mean, it's a very interesting take on it from, from the production point of view, and that brings me back to you, Zakia. But what are your thoughts? I mean, like, she shared her opinion on the production, but now that we're on the receiving end, as she mentioned, countries like Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Niue, now Fiji, all announced plans to ban single-use plastic bags. Do you subscribe to this theory? Do you agree with it? That keeping our oceans healthy and tackling climate change means tackling single-use plastics. What are your thoughts?
Now, the Mariana Trench is it's the deepest part of the ocean. And beyond a certain point, people cannot dive, they cannot swim, submarines cannot go. And scientists have found fish living in the Mariana Trench that have ingested plastic particles, that have plastic in their systems. So the fact that plastic has reached the point, it's gone beyond the point where even humans have not reached, it's quite appalling. So of course, these are initiatives. They're quite, they're well intended, to tackle the ocean plastic pollution issue. My concern is around when we talk about banning single-use plastics, we talk about what's currently quite popular is a ban on plastic straws. And while it's great, while it's well intended, my concern is around people with disabilities. So we're talking about people with maybe, motor issues, people with maybe somebody has a stroke, they cannot move at all, and they rely on just, liquids, and that's all they can ingest. And plastic straws have certain characteristics, such as being flexible, such as, being readily available, being cheap, that make it, quite maybe favorable, when compared to alternatives such as metal straws, even paper straws. So I'm quite concerned that when we talk about maybe a complete ban, on certain single-use plastics, I'm worried that, our policies such as this can be, rather discriminatory, can be ableist. And I think to ensure that this is not done, it's important that we include people from diverse groups in our society, in spaces such as this, in decision-making spaces, at policy-making spaces. Yeah.
Thank you, Zakia. Thank you, Zakia. Justin, the World Bank sees the plastic problem as a critical cornerstone of the development of the blue economy. It has set up a global multi-donor trust fund, ProBlue, aimed at reducing marine litter and pollution. IFC, the International Finance Corporation, which works with the private sector, is focusing on waste on land before it becomes marine waste. Should we all be looking to the land more rather than the sea?
Yeah, I mean, all the waste comes, and I mean, what we're seeing here is all the plastic that goes into the ocean comes from the least developed countries in the world. Again, until we deal with poverty and subsidize some of the costs for cheap plastics, that's a good place to do it, because you cannot expect these least developed islands and coastal communities. That is what any blue initiative is trying to do, without somehow supplementing what they can't afford. We're not San Francisco that can ban everything one hit, because we simply do not have the disposable income here to be able to do that. And it's the same with sewage, it's the same with everything. What we've got to do now, though, is start using and changing be more proactive. And what we've got to do is go to the World Bank, go to COP, go to any of these NGO things, and start saying, we live on probably the richest biodiversity in the planet, by far. Our tropical marine biodiversity is, in a time of global warming, and you're getting a polar migration of cold water species now. There will be a void as the salmon and sardines and anchovies move further north following their cold water. You're having this big void behind them. And what's going to fill that void is animals that come from us. You're finding marlin off of Canada, mahi. It's going to be our food fishes that are going to feed the planet tomorrow. They've got a vested interest in preserving our biodiversity. We got to stop asking for money and saying, this is really in your best interest. This is how you make sure and you mitigate food security issues. Everything we've talked about here comes down to one thing. Poor countries can't afford to get the help we need. We can't afford to deal with some of these issues. But we're sitting on top of the gold mine, and it's not a mine. It's that tropical marine biodiversity. It's not going to be salmon, it'll be mahi-mahi. It's not going to be sardines, it's going to be salala and daniva. It's going to be our fish that are most adaptable to a warmer planet. And that is why we have to encourage people to invest in our biodiversity and find a way so that it's not a handout mentality. We don't like that. But we need a mechanism to transfer technology that is cleaner and better for our oceans. And we've just got to be straight up about it. Otherwise we go around and around and around. I go to these talks all the time. I get so sick of listening to this stuff.
Let's see if we get some support from this side, Justin. Maureen, what would you like to add to that? I mean, he's pointed out a few very important points here with regards to management of this. I mean, would you like to add to that before I give Dr. Stewart the opportunity to?
Now that you put me on the spot, I'm like, I don't think I have anything more to say. I think just to emphasize the point that I think the Pacific Ocean and the health of the Pacific Ocean is critically vital, not just for ourselves and our futures, but for the entire planet. And I think we have to be better at telling our stories. And what is our stories? And how do we tell those stories that will motivate people to understand that we're interconnected. If the world will not take climate change seriously, well, you know what? You're simply just talking about your own futures also. Because what we're facing, you're going to face. They have to be vested in as much as we are in terms of trying to ensure that this next phase of industrialization, which will take place on the oceans, we don't repeat the kinds of mistakes that we've done on land. And we've done terribly. And we should not be, as you correctly point out, we should stop going around that circle. We've done terribly. When you look at the sciences around planetary boundaries and what we've surpassed as a species and what we're doing to ourselves, we've got to start demanding much more from the global community around oceans and protecting it, because we still have some time. We still have some time. It is not impossible to turn that, but it will require people to deal with their own consumption patterns in the global north. In wealthy countries, they have to deal with their consumption patterns, the demand for minerals and new technologies. They have to really consider that. That's their problem. Ours is to say, we have this body of water, this ocean, that can save humanity, but only if we have the political will and want to do this work. But we do. We have to tell our stories better.
Could I add something to that? I'm getting more. You know, you've got to put things in context. The tropical, the real heavy-duty biodiversity is in a place called the Coral Triangle, which we're on the fringes of. But it's only 0.1% of the surface area, but holds something like 40% of marine species. The Great Barrier Reef, when it did a economic assessment of the value to the Australian economy, it came up to $60 billion, and everybody thought that was great. But when you look at the value of tropical marine biodiversity in a time of warming sea temperatures, and you realize that that biodiversity is most likely to adapt and is going to thrive in the future, it came to $12 trillion, the value of the Great Barrier Reef, in terms of how it mitigates and will adapt to climate change. Yeah, we got to stop playing the blame game and go after some of this stuff, and go after it hard, and we've got a case. We just like to be victims.
Dr. Stewart, what would you like to add to this part of the conversation?
I think plastics are essentially an indicator of how much of a mistake we've made with industrial society. Because you can walk onto a beach, pick up a clear plastic bottle, which is housed nothing more than a bit of water, a bit of sugar, and a bit of flavouring that someone's drank and then thrown away. And the plastic itself is an indicator of just how many mistakes we've made about treating the environment as a free source of goods and services. And it's only when you start to bring that value in, you begin to realize that the plastic bottle is actually worth a lot at a kind of a complete cost, not just how much it costs a certain company to make a plastic bottle. That if you take into account the whole process from start to finish, plastic bottle is actually worth much more than anyone would ever throw away. And that is an indication of exactly everything that you're talking about here, that the whole fishing part has to take into account the biodiversity, the processes, the community services that make up that entire package. And that's the value. And that's what we've missed out. That's the mistakes we've made in the past, is that we've treated the ocean as this free sort of thing which just, you can do whatever you like to it, you can trash it, you can harvest from it, it's free, you can do whatever you like. And that was the case 200 plus years ago. But we've now moved on from that, and technology has been the major problem. Ships cruising around, doing all sorts of crazy things. The biggest issue now is really saying to ourselves, hey, we've got to think about everything we do in terms of a complete system. We just can't continue to treat the economy as separate to the environment. They're not. The economy is the environment, just as the environment to us humans is part of everything that we do. And we have to add to everything that we see. In that case, plastic isn't a problem, because we will see plastic for what it is. And that's where we need to get to.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart. Well, before we get into the questions from our audience watching us live, and also from the audience here, Justin, a very interesting concept. Blue Town in Fiji, the Savu Savu Blue Town model, yeah? Which does include waste management and solid waste recycling. Can you explain the concept a little bit more to us?
Yeah, the Blue Town is Savu Savu's a picture perfect place for what we think we can create a blue economy. And a Blue Town concept is based on a blue economy, which is finding strategic partners who want to invest in preserving biodiversity, who will come in and another income source, put in integrated resource management plans in place, recycle wastewater. Plastics, recycle them. Who cares if they don't make economic sense? Because the value is in the mission and in doing this. The economy of scale is never going to work for us for many of these things, but it has to be subsidized, and some of these fundings have to come in. Recycle the plastics, keep them if you want. Recycle our nutrients. Let's do some agriculture. Let's work having MPAs that have an inside of integrated resource management plan, which has a park fee. So these fees can go back into the community and helps reestablish that there is a value to this. And, and then you do what I do also. You work on aquaculture, being bivalve aquaculture, creating and merging conservation and economic returns is what we've got to do. And you will find that for our little town, it would explode. You would attract all sorts of investors. We would have Shell or one of the big fuel companies come and put it there and say, oh, we converted this town from no fuel, just because it's marketing for them. And they can say they're investing in the future of our oceans and planets. Let's start using this. The conscientious consumer, the person who wants to travel, will go to a place like that any day over Bali or anything else, because that's also attractive. I think we're underestimating the amount of people that are out there that would invest and would support these things, and big corporations, because it all makes sense. This makes sense biologically, ocean-wise, health-wise. It's investing in our oceans, and that means helping our island, least developed island countries get systems in place.
Thank you, Justin. I know we could go
Oh,
on
yeah, I
with
could
this
go on
discussion,
and on.
and we also have some questions from our online audience. So we're going to get straight to that. And well, actually, the first question is from Asif, and it's for you, Justin. So thank you so much, Asif, for sending in your question. Now, we're talking about the blue economy. We're often thinking about the best use of our ocean for our own betterment. At the same time, we are destroying our environment and ocean through waste and pollution. How does this match? Is consciousness enough to solve this, or is strict legislation necessary to solve the problem?
Education is going to be it. As people become more educated, they will make a choice. And if, like I said, we're never going to commercially compete with Southeast Asia for producing cans of tuna or anything. But if we can merge, and the blue economy is about creating economic returns and conservation together. And we've just got to think outside the box here. Diving does that, sports diving does. Sports fishing would bring in a lot more money to our economy than seine liners do. I can tell you that right now. And if we just have to tweak things. We have to decide we want to progress and show the rest of the world how to do it. The rest of the world, and to be quite honest, the rest of the world isn't quite as important as our coral reefs, just because of the sheer percentage of biodiversity we represent. We go for it. We do it. You can do it. The consumers are out there. I used to always watch the movie Fight Club, and there was a line in there about IKEA and how we want to support the hard, working, dark-skinned people from the South. That's what we got to do, people. We got to tell our stories. There's so little that we have, but our stories in our part of the world is magical, and it's worth saving.
And I'm sure Maureen will agree with you there. I mean, that is the essence of what she's been driving this evening, is telling our story. Maureen, you have a question from Annabelle. Thank you so much, Annabelle, for sending in your question. Realistically, do you think we can balance economic and population growth with the need to protect the ocean?
That's a good question, and that's a difficult question. And I think, again, it comes down to that whole idea in terms of oceans. I mean, what I'd really like to see is governments doing precisely this thing. What do they value? If you value a healthy ocean, what does it look like? It would require you to take into consideration serious, serious questions about economic drivers of ocean and ocean use. It will force you to take those kinds of discussions. At the moment, we are dealing with all of this in separate pockets. So our base is, if that is the case, then we have to start taking very difficult decisions. What is our position then on deep sea mining, industrial fishing, in particular super seines? What is the role of super seiners? if you say tourism is the driver of your country's economy, what is tourism based on? You have to take difficult decisions, but it starts with what do you value? What do countries value? If they value health, it will have to change the way we behave, it will have to change the decisions, and we need to transition. I mean, business as usual is no longer going to be possible. We can't continue to fish the way we are fishing. Exploit it as a rate we're exploiting land resources, the same as the ocean. Something has to give. And we've got to decide whether we are small enough to be the ones to give first and transition quicker by doing difficult things. And it is possible. I think this idea that, I spoke to someone from Germany not so long ago, and he's like, oh, we can't transition into, from carbon-based dependency of our economies. And I'm like, well, that's just stupid, because that just means that you really don't understand that your life is dependent on that transition. You have to transition. Everybody has to transition. And we need to force that transition quicker for everybody else. But it's not, but we can't stand in that position to say, well, how do we balance economy? Well, economies by its nature will want to exploit, will want to grow. We can do it, but we have to take difficult decisions and really need to see that kind of clarity coming out from our governments about what do they value? What are they going to prioritize? How quickly can they transition on their dependency on bad behaviors? How do they transition? How do they transition with the kinds of subsidies and support to transition? But we've been doing conservation, our governments have been doing conservation measures for a long time. But the end of that question is, who have we conserving for? Has it always been the interest of Pacific people to conserve? I'm not very sure. But I think we need to be very clear that we need to do this. We have to rein in economics. Economic needs to operate within boundaries of natural law and environment. It has always operated on its own. And all the mistakes we've made. It is no longer acceptable to say, how do we balance it? It's now to say, we have to make it happen for our own survival. Otherwise, forget it.
And the money's there.
And the money's there.
And the money's there.
And the consumer's there. Yes, we're saying.
It's all about the money. Maureen, I have a final question for
okay.
you from Snickers in Sydney. Thank you so much for sending in your question. What can small island nations do about plastic pollution? We're back to plastic in terms of what arrives to their shores and what they generate. Is there anything people can start doing today?
I like things like return to sender. Perhaps we should do a return to sender action with all the plastics that we're gathering here and see where it's coming from. But I think that's a clear. Your response was a good one. For me, plastic is a clear representation of failure of humanity, and our dependency on plastics, not just single-use plastics, all kinds of plastics, is phenomenal. And the fact that it's tied to oil is so problematic. But I think it is quite representative of where we are. The throwaway culture. But for me, it's the link. You throw something somewhere so far away from us, and it lands in this part of the world. So again, yes, we do have a problem with litter here, but it's still a massive problem, which is a global problem. So yeah, you've heard me before say I'm quite dismissive, but I'd like to do a return to sender for all these plastics. The tons to send it back on their beaches.
Thank you, Maureen. We'll now open questions for those of you here in the audience, and we'll have the mics. We have our tech team here. So please raise your hand. Again, we want to remind you we have a question down here, and then we'll go up to the gentleman up there for the second question. Just in order of, the hands being raised. Please, if you can also just name the person you're addressing your question to, please.
This question might be, I guess, for Maureen and Justin Milavahav from School of Government Development and International Affairs here at USB. Political will was mentioned many times, and I really like what Justin said about the victimhood. We like to be victims, and you all address the idea that these are global problems that have to be solved in international arena. As a scholar in international relations, I would ask you, is the Pacific as a region willing to go beyond the narrative of victimhood in international politics, in like really stressing these issues? Because if we look at the climate change politics, for instance, that has been the kind of narrative that it's taken to the tables for several years now. Is the region ready to actually take the ownership and show the leadership instead of narrative of victimhood?
It's interesting, the politics of victimhood, because I think the politics of victimhood is, it's perpetuated from both sides. It's not just Pacific Islanders saying, you know, hey, we didn't cause the problem, and therefore, but we're the victims of something. It is also the preferred narrative from the other side, that we remain in a situation of victimhood and ultimately dependent on somebody else to give us the solutions and something else. And so I think it is resisted, but it is quite a difficult one. When you consider that victimhood has a trajectory that goes far, you know, it goes to the periods of colonization and beyond that, because it is tied, it's not separate. So it's not surprising that you will have observations of people who will say, well, you know, Pacific Islanders will just turn up and ask for the money. That's the victimhood statement. But I actually reject that. And I totally think that Pacific people, I mean, yes, there's money, and why should they not ask for that money? But just really be clear that victimhood is played both ways. It is perpetuated, and we can reinforce that, or we can break that damn narrative of victimhood. I am not comfortable in the victimhood statement, because I think I see the lived experiences of our people consistently at the community level, and they don't live in that victimhood statement. They're very clear about their lives, their responsibilities, and then where they need to go. So I think the victimhood one is really very challenging, because it's the easy one. People want to give us voice and agency because they see us as victims, and perhaps we do reinforce that by behaving sometimes as victims of. But we do have cases where we've thrown these narratives on its head and demonstrated. And I think that's where sometimes within the climate, there's this murkiness around that statement of victimhood, but it's always around money. Pacific, always tin can asking for money, and I've heard it several times being said about that kind of statement, and I reject it. I think that there is this disproportionate burden that Pacific people in developing countries shoulder. And I think the West has to accept. You know, you want to talk about responsibilities? Well, guess what? Wealth of the North was built on our backs and our resources. You still owe us. And if we ask for it and demand of it, it should be given, because we have not equaled the balances of power. And it's too easy for us to fall into those kinds of statements. But, you know, we could problematize this question around victimhood pretty quickly, and then it gets uncomfortable because people don't want to talk about the things that have held us in these positions of dependency, serious dependency. So I think there is lots of case studies in the Pacific, and I've already said it, and I keep saying it to young people. We have to lean on our histories of where we've come from, on the kinds of overthrowing of victim and victimhood narratives. We have to go back to Pacific thinkers and writers to find ourselves and be very clear that we have a Pacific worldview. And it's not a victim one. Sometimes we play it well.
I think there's a little bit of victim there, because
This is both.
because there has been proportionally more investment into our fisheries and aquaculture per capita than any other place in the world. And there are interest groups out there that want to keep us in this perpetual state of failure so that they can keep coming back and writing up a proposal for us. We lack the capacity to question them, and that's where we're victims. We're victims. We're not saying, you're wrong, that hasn't worked, you got to go this way, and you're not looking after our interests. You're just trying to click the box on aid money coming in and making sure it doesn't work, because next funding cycle, they're going to do it again. You know what I mean? It's a dirty game, but that is what it is. But we are victims if we don't stand up and say it's not working right, and we don't raise our voices and say, no, we want a plastic recycling plant, and we don't care if it doesn't work economically, because symbolically and for the environment, when you take in that, it does work. And that's where we need to be more empowered and stop being victims.
Thank you, Justin. I mean, we've heard two sides of this. I'd really like to hear as well from Zakia your thoughts on the discussion.
Okay. Can you guys hear me? It's called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. But we have to ask, how much have we in the Pacific contributed to it? When you compare our actions, when you compare these economic activities, industrialization, it's really parts of Asia, Southeast Asia, that are the largest contributors to ocean plastic pollution. So, whether it's, playing the victim, whether it's, having a passive narrative where we say, this is something that's been done to us. As far as I'm concerned, I think it's unfair that we in the Pacific have to foot the bill for what a lot of these overseas rich countries have done. And by virtue of that, I think they need to be held accountable.
Thank you, Zakia. We have a question from the audience. Thank you, sir.
Good evening. I guess my question's to all the panel, but perhaps particularly to Dr. Kinnemonth.
I'm sorry, sir. Could you just say that again?
My question is really to the whole panel, but
right,
perhaps particularly to Dr. Kinnemonth. I'd like to just briefly challenge one of the things that was said at the beginning of the opening remarks, in that there are lots of differing opinions in the room. I don't think so. I can't disagree particularly with anything that anybody said, and I doubt anybody here online in the room or anywhere else that's going to hear this talk would disagree particularly either. There's nuances in the debate for sure, but basically we all agree we're sitting in a seat of higher education, well renowned in the region. We're talking to an intellectual elite. Don't kid yourselves. Yeah. My point is, so far it seems that we, whoever we are, have failed in our efforts to pass these incredibly important messages and suggestions and methods onto the political elite in, let's say, America, perhaps Australia, increasingly in Europe, where anti-intellectualism, anti-science is a growing trend. If we haven't succeeded yet, should we fundamentally change the way we are getting this message across in the world? And it starts, in my opinion, from education in all levels, and I wonder what the panel think about that.
Would you like to start, Dr. Stewart?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I should just check this as well. It's a good question, because one of the interesting things with the climate crisis is that actually we're all victims, and that started to reshape the perspective of what it means to be literally a global citizen. So one of the drivers there is why have we failed? If this is such an obvious issue, why are we having arguments about what to do? We know what to do. The science is really clear. You know, it's literally taught in school now about what could be done to combat climate change. It's just simply not an issue of debate. Why have we failed with that? And the problem is that education is really not designed to combat the whole society issues about usage and industrialization and a whole range of issues. We tend to focus on fairly narrow areas of education, particularly at a university level. You have to specialize, and that limits your capacity to then deal with global problems, the likes of which only a handful of people really truly understand. To innovate and to go beyond where we are today, we've got to really tackle almost every single thing you can think of. It's much bigger than electricity. It encompasses electricity and transport and manufacturing and food consumption. All those areas have got to change. And that's partly what education is now starting to do. It's looking at this very holistic, very team-based approach, but it's taking time. And unfortunately, the politics hasn't caught up yet to that approach.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart. Thank you, Dr. Stewart. I'd invite anyone else in the panel who would like to add. Justin, if you want to say a few words.
Well, I think sometimes climate change activism can be a little too extreme also. And so you're going to get there's always an opposite reaction to every action. And I think there's just got to be a lot more tangible, realistic things that we can do. And I think everybody's got to be responsible in the amount of info that they're getting and how much they're giving. I've gone to these talks and you know, it feels like we're all about to collapse. We're not there yet. And if we can engage and be honest with ourselves, we can work together and actually find a way through this. I think the West and the US and everyone, I think Trump's done a fantastic job making more people aware of climate change than there ever was before. And now is the time when we should go. You know, nobody even knew about that a couple of years ago. He's done a great job for us. And now we have to go back and work on those that want to do the opposite. We have to do this, and we've got to change the game.
Maureen, would you like to say a few words?
Maybe that in addition to science, we have to be looking at indigenous knowledge systems as a way to educate also. Maybe to revive some of that understanding, because I think that's quite critical, in addition to science and knowledge. So there's just another way to think about education that is not just formal in classrooms, but it will incorporate indigenous knowledge systems, which are a little bit more holistic. And people talk about, you know, sustainability. They look to some of these knowledge systems as being much more sustainable than.
I think it's also important to say that we are having the conversation, you know, and I think, to be quite honest, Fiji was good at opening that door. You know, Ocean's Pathway was something that COP and the industrial nations had absolutely no connection with ocean issues before. And you know, it's now up to us to start creating this change. We can't expect everybody else to do it. But the door is opening and the opportunity is coming, and we've got to step up and start doing things.
And we'll hear from Zakia. So I think it's a great question because we get to hear from the entire panel before we close off tonight. So just a final note from Zakia, and then I'll just invite Dr. Stewart to conclude.
Okay. It's been said earlier that the science is clear. Indeed it is. It is an irrefutable act that the climate crisis, the climate catastrophe is real, and it is happening. Governments need to acknowledge this. Governments need to understand this. The Australian government has to stop giving subsidies to the coal mine in Queensland. the US government and its president has to realize that the climate crisis is real and it's happening and it's affecting us. Like you mentioned, whether, are we educating, are we creating enough awareness? What is the reason why do governments not understand, this pressing issue? Why are they not addressing it with the immediate attention it needs? I think when we look back to history, any form of political right, any form of civil right that people have achieved, they've done it through civic disobedience. So maybe if education does not get the work done, maybe that is what we have to resort to. And then you look to what's been done in London a few months ago by Greta Thunberg, who is my shiro. Her and, the multitude of the school kids who did a school strike, so they did not go to school on Friday. And they came out, in the streets of London, and they barricaded roads. They didn't allow cars to go through. They created so much disruption, and all these adults around this, this huge group, they got so annoyed because they have to get to work, they have things to do, they're so busy. But I think this is what we need. We need to disrupt, lives. We need to cause maybe a little bit of disobedience to get the kind of attention that the climate crisis needs immediately.
Thank you, Zakia. And I think a final note to you from Dr. Stewart before we close off tonight.
Yeah, I'm very impressed to hear your views, because the climate crisis is exactly a climate crisis. And, when I was born, it was 319 parts per million. Now it's 409. It is continuing to increase every year. And yet we watch the TV and we see sports teams playing, advertising new this, new that. It's not even on the TV. I just disagree with Justin that it should be front and center of literally everyone's perspective. On the front of every newspaper, it should tell you what the global carbon content of the atmosphere is. And that would really alarm people. In fact, someone like me who spent a lot of time reading all the articles and books, etc., it's much worse than I would have thought it was previously. Because the information is right across everything from disease to sea level rise to everywhere that we do and everything that we do and everywhere that we live, it will have a major impact. And we are just not we're just not accepting that because the media isn't allowing that to come through. So I'm very pleased to see your reaction, because that is the sort of reaction that we're going to have to get used to, that the young people are going to be very, very angry at people like myself, older people who have allowed this to happen, and we've got to stop. Yeah, we've got to wake up.
Thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's all we have time for tonight. Thanks to the head of school and senior lecturer at the School of Marine Studies here at USB, Stuart Kinnenmont. Thank you so much. Maureen Penchueli, the coordinator of the Pacific Network on Globalization, PANG. Zakia Ali, member of Project Survival Pacific, and Mr. Justin Hunter, the founder of J. Hunter Pearls. Let's show them our appreciation. We also would like to thank our audience through our live stream and all our campuses, all our USB campuses. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Michelle Tevita Singh. Enjoy the rest of the night. Binaka Bakalevu. Oh my.